Hello, my name is Emily Talbot, and I'm the Chief Curator of the Norton Simon Museum. Édouard Manet's imposing painting, The Ragpicker, or Chiffonnier in French, is a nearly life-size depiction of a street salvager. And it's one of the best-known pictures in the museum's collections, where it has long been installed in the place of honor at the far end of our 19th century wing. Painted in the late 1860s, the ragpicker depicts the practitioner of a now obsolete profession in Paris that involved sorting through garbage to extract still usable materials, such as textiles and food waste. These would be sold to the manufacturers of paper, soap, or perfume. By employing a full-length format made famous by his hero, the 17th century Spanish painter Diego Velázquez, Manet asserts his respect for the elderly ragpicker, who is pictured with the tools of his trade, a staff and sack, as well as a pile of cast-offs in the lower left corner. Looking closely, we can just make out a broken champagne bottle, lemon peels, and oyster shells, perhaps discarded by the previous night's revelers. The ragpicker was coated in an overly thick varnish that dulled its surface and obscured Manet's brushwork. In advance of loaning the picture to the Frick collection in 2019, we had the opportunity to send it, along with the Simons' two other canvases by Manet, to the Department of Paintings Conservation at the J. Paul Getty Museum, part of a long-standing conservation agreement between our two institutions. Today I'm speaking with Devi Ormond, Associate Conservator of Paintings at the Getty, to learn about some of the surprises she encountered while working on this painting. When tests revealed that the varnish was composed of shellac and drying oil, materials more commonly associated with polishing furniture than varnishing paintings, Devi took a new approach to thin rather than completely remove this layer. Her treatment reveals new subtleties in Manet's paint handling and palette, and leaves the door open for further research on the safe dissolving of this unusual type of synthetic varnish. Devi, welcome. And thank you once again for sharing your working process with us.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you and to all at the Norton Simon for giving me this wonderful, wonderful opportunity.
Let's begin by discussing the condition of the ragpicker when it arrived at the Getty. Can you tell us about the surface qualities of the painting and what effect they had on the appearance of the picture?
On looking at the painting before treatment, it was still, as you said, an imposing work, really quite striking, full-length portrait of this ragpicker with this still life in the foreground. It was a legible painting, but those scholars and conservators who know the work of Manet could see that this particular work had something very strange going on with the surface. There seemed to be a kind of a fog, if I could put it that way, a fog sort of concealing what is known of Manet's painting technique. And the background in particular seemed to be very sort of cluttered, and it had been noted that a very thick varnish layer was on top. So that was one of the reasons that we really wanted to have a closer look to try and investigate what was going on, what was preventing the painting from exhibiting the artistic talents of Manet from this particular period. But then we looked at the painting in ultraviolet light, and you can see from the image this incredible sort of striking blue, which is a very strong indication to us that it is a synthetic varnish, as opposed to other paintings which might have a natural resin varnish, and it was really making it very difficult to see what was lying underneath. Normally, when we look at a painting in ultraviolet light, it's very easy to distinguish between the original work of an artist and that work that might have been added later by another hand, such as a restorer. In this case, the fluorescence of the varnish was so strong that it was making it very, very difficult to find out how damaged the painting was and the extent of the retouching and what was the retouching actually covering up. The tests were carried out, and what we did find is that there was a varnish layer which could be easily removed. We removed that uppermost varnish layer, but what we found then is when that varnish layer was removed that we had, again, this very strong fluorescence. So that fluorescence was relating to another varnish. There was still so much more varnish on this painting, and it did not dissolve in the solvent that was used to remove the uppermost varnish layer.
At this stage, I know you were consulting with colleagues at the Getty Conservation Institute. What did they discover when they analyzed the underlying varnish layer?
A high content of a polyurethane polymer. We also found shellac, very unusual to find that on a painting. And it seemed that there was numerous layers, so shellac, a urethane varnish, a vinyl varnish, and essentially varnishes that we would not normally associate with applying on top of a painted surface. I mean, applying it to a painting is something that I have not come across that has cross-linked. So as the polymer ages, it cross-links and it gets harder and harder and harder to remove. So we were really in a dilemma. The thickness of it was really quite disturbing. It was sort of seeping into those beautiful contours of Manet's brushwork so that they weren't sharp and they didn't jump out at the viewer as they should have been doing because they were just, again, as I would say, clogged with this varnish.
I remember asking you to explain the significance of these findings, and you said, it's basically like putting furniture polish on a painting. So it was pretty alarming to hear that these materials had been used on such an iconic painting in our collection. How did you proceed with this information?
I then reached out again to the conservation scientists to see if we could come up with a method of removing it without damaging the original paint layer. And this went on for several months, and we found ourselves in a situation where we could not find a method to remove this thick varnish layer safely without damaging the underlying paint layer. The disappointment of not being able to take this thick layer off was something that you don't really appreciate if you're a conservator, because you would, of course, love to show the painting in its original glory, and in this case, it just wasn't safe enough to do that. However, what we were able to do is come up with a solution that enabled us to thin it so that we were able to reduce the thickness of the varnish, to bring out some of that brushwork, the quality that I was talking about earlier, particularly in the more thickly painted areas. Even though it wasn't an ideal solution, we felt that if we were to go any further, we would be damaging the original.
Well, not what you had hoped for, obviously, but I think what you managed to do in terms of thinning the varnish did make a huge difference in the surface appearance of this painting. Can you tell us a little bit about Manet's brushwork and other things that you noticed improving as a result of your treatment?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, again, they're very, very subtle differences, but they're differences that make Manet the amazing artist that he is. His ability to place the figure within a space. I really feel that by reducing the varnish, that we were able to bring that back. There's a sense now that this chiffonnier actually is standing within a space. Prior to treatment, it felt that he was kind of floating. We weren't really able to kind of place his feet on the ground, so to speak. The figure is in beautiful condition. So what we were able to take out from the treatment was the thicker applications of paint in the hands, in the face, in the foreground. I mean, the lemon really began to pop out, and the green of the rinds, the cork of the champagne bottle that I'd never really paid much attention to before has these beautiful red lakes that weren't visible. We saw little touches of blue in the base of the bottle of the broken champagne bottle, as well as tiny little details within his hands, within the larger brushstrokes that depict the sack that he's holding over his shoulder. Again, small little tiny flickers of colour in his hands that were really concealed under the thick varnish. And this beautiful sort of fluffy nature of his beard. It felt so much more tactile. And also that ragged, rugged look, which is quite piercing, if I have to say, of this figure.
Yes, I think piercing is the perfect way to describe the ragpicker's expression. And because of how large the painting is and where we're positioned as viewers when it's hung in the galleries, you can really appreciate the emergence of these subtle but striking dabs of color in the hands, bottle, and lemon. Given the satisfying balance between the figure and these still life elements, it looks like Manet always intended the picture to be just so, but the X-ray actually reveals that he made a lot of changes to the composition over time.
Oh yes, I mean, this is the exciting part of taking an X-ray, is that, you can really start to see the thought processes that the artist is having during the working or the creation of a portrait like this. And one of the really interesting things is that he made quite a few compositional changes which we can't really see in normal light. However, I will say to the viewers, when you are going to look at the portrait, may I draw your attention to the lower left corner where the still life is. And when you look really, really closely in that corner, you'll see there are some brush strokes that actually extend up onto the left side of the composition. And in the X-ray, this actually shows as more debris. So initially, Manet had painted the still life of the debris from the night revelers before up almost to the ankle of his proper right foot, which showed sort of straw and other material that looked like sort of, old pieces of waste. But he decided to reduce the still life, which I think is actually probably a good thing, because it doesn't take away from the figure, who's so incredibly striking. Some other very small modifications he made were to his feet, the positioning of his feet, just slightly shifting them up. And then also to the staff, that long stick that he's holding, it was at a much more of a diagonal. I think it would have gone in front of his proper left foot. What's interesting about that change in the position of the staff is it relates very closely to a sketch he made of this painting in which that staff is at the diagonal. So there's a very nice connection between this sketch and the painting as it currently is. Another change, originally the thumb was more bent, and he seems to have put that thumb back in, and possibly reworked the hands at a later stage. And another compositional change is at the face. One of the amazing things about Manet is part of his painting technique is he seems to scrape the paint off if he's not happy with what he's done, and repaint the areas again. And we see that in the X-ray, this wonderful scratching away of paint in the face. The rim of the hat has been slightly altered. We think originally his eyes would have been more in shadow, but now what we do is we can actually see that piercing gaze of the ragpicker, that he has decided that this is a preferable gaze that he wishes to attain in his painting process.
It's pretty astonishing what we can learn about the development of a composition through an X-ray, even with the thick synthetic varnish present. Devi, thank you so much for walking us through the complexities of this particular treatment, which, while not what you anticipated, did result in a really effective outcome for the ragpicker. I hope that all of our listeners will be able to visit this painting in the galleries to appreciate its new appearance. Thank you so much, Devi, for taking the time to speak with me.
My pleasure, as always.